You're listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are around the world tonight. We're going to take a look back in history a little ways, back to the 1940s and 50s, and we're going to look at the suppressed UFO research of the 1940s and 50s. Well, wouldn't you know that before the modern advent of the UFO phenomenon, there were people actually in the realms of academia and scientific areas of this world looking into and researching the problems with UFOs and the phenomena associated with it. These people didn't get a lot of attention in the mainstream at that time until sometime around 1947, but a good year prior to that, there were those who were exploring some of these avenues of thought, researching UFOs, and some of the conclusions they came up with about this phenomenon are quite shocking. And much of it has been suppressed and pushed under the radar in the coming years thereafter. So tonight we're going to explore the depths of some of this suppressed UFO research. And we're going to find some conclusions that were drawn by some of those early people who were looking at this in a serious way. And we're going to see how some of the dots begin to connect with what we know. And here's the thing. We are seeing a resurgence in the mainstream of attention being given to the notion of UFOs. Now, they've rebranded this phenomena many times already, and now they refer to it primarily as UAP, Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon. So that being the case, it's getting a lot of mainstream attention, and the high weirdness of the time we're living in is coming into view more and more as each day passes. So it's important that we go back and we look at some of the things that were determined early on in the arisal in the modern era of this UFO phenomenon. Now, many of these things were outright rejected by the mainstream scientific community early on as they pursued some more objective ways of understanding this phenomenon, but much of those have really not come to much clearer of an understanding of what's going on with this. And when you look at the approximations that were made by some of these early researchers, you could begin to understand what's been done here and how a lot of this, and even according to these researchers, was suppressed and clamped down upon by institutions within and around government for various reasons. And we may get into some of those reasons here tonight. But first, how do we come across this information? How do we know where this comes from and who is behind some of this early research? And what can we know about it? Well, in order to understand, let's delve back into some of the popular stories that have arisen around UFO culture and ufology culture by many of those who have pursued research within this field. And this will take us back to an incident which is alleged to have happened in 1954. In 1954, President Eisenhower allegedly came down with a really bad toothache and was expedited away from where he was staying while he was on vacation to be seen by the quote-unquote dentist. And of course, according to the stories surrounding the UFO phenomenon and UFO culture and ufology, as it's come to be known, this was when Eisenhower is said to have been spirited away to Muroc military base, where he had a secret meeting with extraterrestrials. Now, is there anything to this story? Hard to say for sure, but I think much about what may or may not be connected with this has been muddled through the course of time. So in order to have any type of a connection back to this story and where it is that many of those within the auspices of the ufology community have come up with evidence for this having happened, this event at Muroc, we go back to a letter which was written by one Mr. Gerald Light. And we're going to get into this letter. I'm going to read this letter for you. And then we're going to connect some dots, and we're going to go back to, actually, the recipient of this letter, who he was, and how this is an important connection to some of the early researches into the UFO phenomenon. So in 1954, early 1954, April of 1954, this is when the alleged incident happened where Eisenhower had a top-secret meeting, allegedly, with aliens or extraterrestrials or UFO occupants at a military base. And he was said by the mainstream press to have suffered from some type of a dental emergency and was spirited away and was missing for the entire time of 2 or 3 days or some such thing as the story goes. Now, where do they get this from? Well, a lot of it has to do with this letter, and you can find this. This letter is available online in various places, and you can find it. And this letter was received April 16th, 1954, by Mr. Meade Layne. And it was sent to him by a gentleman named Gerald Light. Now, when you begin to delve into the depths of this story, who was Gerald Light, you come to find out that much of what you can find out about this guy is all second-hand hearsay. And that it would seem that the mainstream record of this Gerald Light would suggest to you that he was a New Age charlatan, or some type of a hoaxer or huckster. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. Having delved a little deeper into the story than this, I begin to really question, is that the case? Was this guy really a huckster or a hoaxer or some type of a New Age charlatan looking for attention and to fill his bank account? Or was there something else going on here? And when you begin to really research deeper into the story here, you find there's things that don't connect to that explanation for this story. So one of these things that comes up is, was this guy a charlatan or not? And you really can't find an awful lot in the record as to how much money he was able to acquire and what kind of attention he really got, because most people have never heard of this guy, let's be honest. And if this was a guy that was just in it for fame and fortune, he didn't really get there, did he? His name was Gerald Light. He had some connections within academia and within the areas of occultism and within government as well, and various other places. And we'll see how this representation of him through mainstream sources now that depict him as a charlatan, I don't think that really stands up to muster. But maybe, even if it does, what can be garnered from this is more than would apply to this one gentleman involved in this case. There were other things going on, other quiet researches going on in the background at this time and just prior to it that led to some conclusions that perhaps officialdom didn't want to get out there because of various reasons, one of those reasons probably being they didn't want the public to panic, or they didn't want to upset the apple cart of what it is that the public believes in the mainstream culture. And since then, many other things have come to the surface, but let's go ahead and we'll actually get into this letter to give you better context of what's going on here. And then we're going to look back even further before the writing of this letter and this communication from this Gerald Light to this Meade Layne And we'll explore exactly who was Meade Layne and the importance of all of this as we progress here. But let's get to the letter itself. It was from Gerald Light, and he has his address on here, and it's addressed to Mr. Meade Layne, San Diego, California. My dear friend, I have just returned from Muroc, and it says in parentheses here, as a side note to the letter, that it was later renamed Edwards Air Force Base. He says, the report is true, devastatingly true. I made the journey in company with Franklin Allen of the Hearst Papers and Edwin Norse of Brookings Institute, Truman's erstwhile financial advisor, and Bishop McIntyre of L.A., and it says here, confidential names for the present, please. When we were allowed to enter the restricted section after about 6 hours in which we were checked on every possible item, event, incident, and aspect of our personal and public lives, I had the distinct feeling that the world had come to an end with fantastic realism. For I have never seen so many human beings in a state of complete collapse and confusion as they realized that their own world had indeed ended with such finality as to beggar description. The reality of the other plane aeroforms is now and forever removed from the realms of speculation and made a rather painful part of the consciousness of every responsible scientific and political group. During my 2 days' visit, I saw 5 separate and distinct types of aircraft being studied and handled by our Air Force officials with the assistance and permission of the Etherians. I have no words to express my reactions. It has finally happened. It is now a matter of history. President Eisenhower, as you may already know, was spirited over to Muroc one night during his visit to Palm Springs recently, and it is my conviction that he will ignore the terrific conflict between the various authorities and go directly to the people via radio and television if the impasse continues much longer. From what I could gather, an official statement to the country is being prepared for delivery about the middle of May. I will leave it to your own excellent powers of deduction to construct a fitting picture of the mental and emotional pandemonium that is now shattering the consciousness of hundreds of our scientific authorities and all the pundits of the various specialized knowledges that make up our current physics. In some instance, I could not stifle a wave of pity that arose in my own being as I watched the pathetic bewilderment of rather brilliant brains struggling to make some sort of rational explanation which would enable them to retain their familiar theories and concepts. And I thanked my own destiny for having long ago pushed me into the metaphysical woods and compelled me to find my way out. To watch strong minds cringe before totally irreconcilable aspects of science is not a pleasant thing. I had forgotten how commonplace things as dematerialization of solid objects had become to my own mind. The coming and going of an etheric or spirit body has been so familiar to me these many years I had forgotten that such a manifestation could snap the mental balance of a man not so conditioned. I shall never forget those 48 hours at Muroc. Signed G.L. Gerald Light. In this letter, sent to his friend Meade Layne. 1954, April 16th. So there you have a little bit of the background as to where much of the story about Eisenhower's secret meeting with aliens came about. A lot of it can be attributed to this letter. This letter does exist. It did exist. It's still archived and kept. The authenticity of the letter, it is not doubted that Gerald Light wrote it and sent it to Meade Layne. It certainly does exist. It's a factual document. But is the story being told true? Were there really aliens who landed at Muroc and were working with Air Force officials and scientists there, showing them how their craft worked? Did this really happen? And many a question has arisen around this, and a whole mythology has arisen around this. So is this true? Did something of this sort really happen? We have to wonder. Now, a lot surrounding the whole UFO topic has been locked down under a tight lid of security for a very long time. Now, a lot of this story would sound like fanciful fiction were it not for exactly who this Meade Layne guy was. Who was this guy, you may ask? Well, let's look up a little bit of information about him, shall we? Meade Layne was an American academic and early researcher of ufology and parapsychology. Best known for proposing an early version of what's called the Interdimensional hypothesis to explain flying saucer sightings. Now, he began researching this and publicly publishing papers as far back as 1946, or even 1945. Layne was the founder and first director of Borderland Sciences Research Associates, later came to be known as Borderland Sciences Research Foundation. Prior to his public work studying UFOs, Layne was professor at the University of Southern California. That's right, he was a professor at USC. And an English department head at Illinois Wesleyan University and Florida Southern College. In February of 1945, Meade began publishing a mimeograph newsletter titled Round Robin. On October 14, 1946, nearly a year before Kenneth Arnold's first sighting of flying saucers, Layne achieved national notoriety when the wire service carried a story of his claims of a medium who was in telepathic communication with people in a spaceship. And I'm going to pause there for a moment. Now, we've done some episodes in the past talking about some of the early contactee movement in the 1940s and 50s. Mostly the 50s. The contactee movement didn't really begin to emerge until the 1950s. Definitely post-World War II, like a good time after the Kenneth Arnold sightings and everything that made the UFO phenomenon mainstream at that time. But certainly, this guy was a little ahead of the curve. He was discussing this stuff and exploring ideas surrounding it since at least 1945 publicly. So it says here, the following year, during the 1947 flying disc craze, media again quoted Layne on his ethership theories. Layne speculated that rather than representing advanced military or extraterrestrial technology, flying saucers were piloted by beings from a parallel dimension which he referred to as Etheria. And their ether ships were usually invisible but could be seen when their atomic motion became slow enough. He further claimed that the Etherians could become stranded on the terrestrial plane when their ether ships malfunctioned, and that various governments were aware of these incidents and investigated them. I'm going to pause for a moment. So he was claiming governments had already investigated this prior to the Kenneth Arnold sightings in 1947, and of course, that's also the year of the alleged Roswell incident. So he claimed governments of the world had already been studying this phenomenon, had understood it to a certain degree, and knew a couple things about it, and they were suppressing some of this knowledge because it related more to occult principles than it did to some type of technological craft. Now, what has happened since then is largely the extraterrestrial hypothesis was introduced and given a strong push. And this was popularized as the most reasonable explanation for this phenomenon. But it would appear that they knew something different much before the pushing and the acceptance of the extraterrestrial phenomenon as being the most likely explanation for these things. Now, Meade Layne and his research foundation were exploring this way of thinking long before many others who came along later, like the Jacques Valleys of the world and the John Keels, and those who were proffering some differing view from the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Now, I know a lot of this may sound redundant to some of you, but this is important to understand, because if they understood this had more to do with something supernatural, paranormal, or interdimensional rather than a physical explanation, suppressing this information becomes very much detrimental to the study of the phenomenon itself, at least to the external sources, those outside of the programs looking at it. So when you consider that there were those who were studying this phenomenon who knew some things about the occult and were applying those methodologies of knowledge to this problem, then you begin to realize perhaps they were coming to some different conclusions about what they were looking at than what was presented to the public in the mainstream consciousness. And all of this had to do with a method of reimagining the image of man in the universe and the image of the universe and of itself within the minds of men. You see, it had to do with establishing a new baseline for people, pushing people further towards this hyper-materialist paradigm when they knew at the core of many of the official studies of this that this phenomenon supersedes anything physical. It is a superphysical phenomenon. But yet they tried to explain it and put it in this little box of physical phenomena in order to steer the minds of men into this hyper-materialist paradigm way of thinking. And they knew that this phenomenon, in and of itself, was a very important thing in the coming age that they were stepping into. And now we're beginning to see transformations in society and culture around us that are beginning to think outside the box with a lot of this stuff, but certainly you still have those who very much want to explain away all of this stuff as nothing more than some physical, material world phenomenon or set of phenomena that could be explained by all sorts of reasonable applications of our physical world knowledge. And thus they've come up with programs like Project Blue Book to explain away all of these things that defy the laws of physics as we know them, and they come up and they proffer all sorts of explanations for this. It was swamp gas. It was people that were looking at the planet Venus but didn't realize that's what it was. It was ball lightning. It was this. It was that. Many of these things don't stand up to scrutiny when you begin to explore the phenomenon in depth and detail. The question remains, what lies at the back of this phenomenon? Is it something that is simply physical? Is it an aberration of the mind of man? Is it some type of mass hysteria that has taken hold and people misidentifying things? Or is there a real phenomenon behind it, some super physical, supernatural, super sensible phenomena behind all of this? Or is it a combination of all those things? Well, it's hard to tell for sure. But let's go back and look at what has been established and determined prior to the events of 1947, the Kenneth Arnold sightings, and the alleged Roswell phenomenon, the Roswell incident that happened, and all of the various things that led up to modern UFO culture, including the early contactee movement of the 1950s and the sightings and the UFO flaps of the 1950s, of which there were many. This phenomenon emerged in a new way at that time, and it was very much something that was on the radar of the military-industrial complex, the emerging military-industrial complex at that time. But according here to Meade Layne, he claimed that there were intelligent beings who manufactured and controlled these craft, and that these were indeed craft that were coming here from what he termed the realm of etheria, otherwise known in the occult as the etheric plane. And this becomes very important when you begin to delve deeper into this research. You see, Meade Layne and his fellow researchers, in his foundation that he formed to study these things, Borderland Sciences Research Foundation, They understood some of the precepts of occultism, of theosophy, of Rosicrucianism, of these many forms of the secret doctrine that were taught. And they recognized and understood what this phenomena represented. It represented this crossover point in the etheric. And they began to recognize some of the principles that were present in the earlier works of physicists who studied the ether prior to the adoption of Einstein's relativity theory. And he tried to reconcile some of these things. He wrote many books and proposals about this stuff prior to it being a mainstream popular topic. In 1948, Layne was featured in media for his proposal to use underwater radar to search for the mythical lost continent of Atlantis. In 1950, press covered Layne's publication of Flying Discs, the Ethership Mystery and Its Solution. Layne also publicized earlier stories of a crashed saucer with 30-inch tall bodies found inside. That was in the 1940s he wrote about this. The 1940s. In 1951, Layne promoted Paxson Hayes' claims about ancient giants in Mexico. Furthermore, Layne argued that the Etherians and their ether ships inspired much of Earth's mythology and religion, but that they were truly mortal beings despite having a high level of technological and spiritual advancement. He claimed that their motive in coming to the terrestrial plane of existence was to reveal their accumulated wisdom to humanity. These revelations would be relayed through individuals with sufficiently developed psychic abilities, allowing them to contact the Etherians and communicate with them directly. And in particular, he relied upon a couple people within his organization to communicate, allegedly, with some of these Etherians, as he claimed. Now, are there some tenets of truth to some of this? It's really difficult to ascertain for sure what is true and what is false with the claims of ufology and the ufology community. Many of these ideas seem to have some merit to them. There is a real phenomenon at play. There's only so much we can know about it. And when you dig deep enough, you always find connections back to the occult and to this secret doctrine. And certainly, this Meade Layne fellow understood very clearly what he was looking at because he was familiar with these systems from the Rosicrucians and others. As we will see in his own writings here, because we're going to read from The Ethership Mystery and Its Solution, written by Meade Layne and published in 1950. Originally. This version of it that we're going to read from is a later re-edition thereof. This guy was well ahead of the curve in his thinking on this, and that he recognized some occult principles at play here that most of the other mainline or mainstream ufology researchers often ignored and overlooked because it just seemed way too fantastical for them. They would rather try to explain it as some technological extraterrestrial race, something you could physically touch and feel. And this guy was suggesting what it seems to be a more accurate picture of this phenomenon, that these entities that they call extraterrestrials or aliens or some such thing that they attach to this notion, they are not physical beings in the way we would recognize or know them. So, that being the case, you have to really think outside the box, and you have to explore some of the old ways of thinking. You have to go back and look at what is taught in this secret doctrine as to the nature of reality, that there are different planes or layers of existence, that there are subplanes that exist, that interpenetrate the plane we live in and are around us. And more importantly, you have to think in terms of frequency and vibration, as Nikola Tesla advised us to do, to understand this. And that is what has always been brought forward in these occult teachings. And a lot of it has been made to look silly by the New Age movement, all the love and light people out there. And it sounds hokey to think in terms of frequency and vibration, but you need to understand that. In order to understand this barrier between the planes of existence of reality. And I believe Meade Layne refers to this as a meniscus of sorts that interpenetrates and interconnects these layers of reality, these different planes of existence. The etheric plane, according to Rosicrucianism and some of the other systems, is a subplane of this dense physical material plane on which we reside. But it is made of a finer type of matter than what we are accustomed to. We are in a very dense state. We are in what the Rosicrucians refer to as the dense chemical region of physicality. And they also refer to this etheric region, which consists of 4 layers above and beyond the 3 that we are familiar with here. And the Rosicrucian system describes these as the different facets or concepts of matter as we recognize them. Now, this is going back to the time of the 1900s, early 1900s, when much of this was brought forward into the mainstream once again and reconsidered, and they taught that we have these 3 manifestations of physical matter as we know them. We have solids, liquids, and gases, and then they claim there are 4 layers above that border upon etheric matter. Now, we've since come to realize and know in our modern science that there are other states of matter other than solid, liquid, and gas, one of which is plasma, and this seems to be this meniscus layer between dense chemical physical reality and the etheric portion thereof, if you want to look at it from the Rosicrucian system. Now, this was all promulgated and speculated on not only by this guy, this Meade Layne in the 1940s and 50s, but also by others long before that. And what was postulated here is that possibly these intelligences that are the pilots of these craft come from that etheric region of our reality. You see, they are not physical beings as we would understand them. They are etheric beings. Now, you could go ahead and make your own conclusions about what all that could possibly mean, but we'll tell you what Mr. Layne and others in this Borderland Scientific Research Foundation thought about all of this. We're going to read from The Ethership Mystery and Its Solution, originally published in 1950. And many of the conclusions reached here, you could rest assured, the scientific military-industrial complex probably took a lot of this very seriously and began to explore these ways of thinking in approaching this phenomenon. But they kept the lid of secrecy clamped down on it that tight that they didn't want to let on to the American public that they were looking into the occult aspects of this, because there's a stigma attached with that, especially in society at that time. They wouldn't want people to think that they were dabbling with dark occult things. And most certainly, now we know, with hindsight, that that is in fact what has gone on within government programs and quasi-government programs for a very, very long time. But it's all about perception management. That's why they steered the public away from thinking in these types of terms relating back to occult principles, and they tried to steer people towards this hyper-materialist paradigm way of thinking about this phenomenon. We'll explain it as extraterrestrials. They flew here through outer space from other planets. This is where that idea and notion became popularized. And we'll see there might be actually some crossover with that. All these things are possible. I certainly don't claim to have the answers to all of this, but I think it's worth approaching this from the different angles of understanding. And we can't just rely on the physical science's means of exploring these things. We need to look at the occult principles underlying it as well and understand whether you want to accept it or not. It's always present. Always present. But without further ado, let's read from the Ether Ship Mystery and its Solution. The series of aerial phenomena, which are here described under the term ether ships, and it says in parentheses, flying saucers, first attracted public attention in the fall of 1946. It was by no means the first appearance of these craft in the skies of our planet, but very few persons were aware of this fact, and the public as a whole at first refused to credit the reports at all. The newspapers, the radio, and many psychologists and scientific workers joined in discrediting the alleged facts and in attributing them to delusion or deliberate falsifying. Nevertheless, the evidence continued to accumulate, with most circumstantial and detailed reports from competent observers, until finally systemic investigation was undertaken by the United States Air Force. Going to pause for a moment. A systemic investigation needed to be undertaken by the United States Air Force. Now, this is recorded fact. We know this. We know there was a bit of a panic in the time of the post-World War II era, with sightings of strange things in the sky. And we know the Air Force took an interest in this, the military forces took an interest in this, and they had to do lip service to the people. They knew some of it had to do with experimental aircraft they were building, and they were trying to deflect from that for national security reasons, and there were other aspects of this as well. We had the post-war jitters, and of course, this was the onset of the Cold War, as it came to be known, and there were tensions that were very high at that time. Let's read on. The outcome of this was indeed curious, since after some 2 years of study of the phenomena, the Air Force has recently announced officially that there is no genuine and factual basis for the reports. The explanation for this will doubtless become clear at some future time. The public, however, shows no sign of accepting this remarkable pronouncement. New reports of the strange sky visitors appear almost daily, and their existence is definitely established. The purpose of these pages, therefore, is not to argue the case for the existence of the discs or saucers, since data would run to some hundreds of pages, but rather to present as simply as possible the true nature and meaning of the phenomena. It seems to us important, and in the nature of public duty, that this be done. There is already apprehension in the minds of many, and if, as we expect, many more striking craft are attributed to some foreign and unfriendly government, hostility and fear might develop. And if they are believed to come from some other planet of our solar system, unreasoning and superstitious fear is to be reckoned with, perhaps with a considerable degree of social disintegration. This latter hypothesis, in fact, is already being advanced in all seriousness, though for no better reason than that no other origin seems conceivable. Yet there is another possible source, and we are convinced the true source, for these strange craft, and the time has come when this explanation must be made available to everyone in the simplest terms possible. I'm going to pause for a moment. So, they recognized early on that the extraterrestrial hypothesis was going to be the only one that they accepted as a reasonable explanation for this, largely because the public was very ignorant of these occult principles that those who've studied these things are not. And it was all about perception management. So Mr. Meade Layne continues, and he says, "Unfortunately, not everyone will find the explanation easily understandable. It cannot be disposed of by a word of 1 or 2 syllables only, such as Mars, Venus, or even Russia, but requires a little sustained attention and mental effort. On the other hand, the interest of most of our readers will not be in the physics and the speculative science involved, but in a few eminently practical questions, such as, number 1, what are the flying discs? Number 2, where do they come from? Number 3, who operates them? Number 4, why do they come into our skies? And number 5, are they friendly or are they dangerous? An answer to these questions, if it can be given, will probably satisfy the active curiosity of most readers. To those of a more reflective mind, and to the scientist, philosopher, and non-dogmatic religionist, such answers, baldly put, will be only a shadowy beginning or perhaps too fantastic to reckon with at all. But for our present purposes, we shall neglect these tough-minded and critical folk and answer our own questions in a more categorical way. Gonna pause for a moment. So they began to ask the pertinent questions here, and this is what had arisen, especially in the military investigations of these things. Now the evidence began to mount up, and it became very clear that there was more to this than just misidentifying some explainable thing. These were actual craft. These were actually a phenomenon that did exist, was observable, and it was different from any natural explanation that could be given. There were real disc-shaped craft showing up, and other shaped craft as well, not just discs. Unidentified craft being seen, spotted in the air by credible observers and witnesses. And the data was mounting up. It was becoming a more and more numerous phenomenon. And we're seeing a similar uptick in this in recent days here. So let's start with the question, what are these flying discs? First, let us say what they are not. Now, this is a good approach that Meade Layne and Associates here at Borderland Sciences Research Foundation took as a tact towards this. He says, first, let us say what they are not. This is objective negation to come to a subjective synthesis. This is a good foundation for working from. This is a good observational method that doesn't get applied a lot in our modern thinking, but it is an important one nonetheless. It is an alchemical way of thinking. So this guy was using some critical thinking skills and some old ways of approaching problems to get to an answer. So he says, what are they not? He says, first, they are not delusions, fantasy, or lies. They are not constructed by any foreign government or by our own. They do not come from the depths of the sea, though some of them may enter the sea at times. They do not come from the polar regions or from Tibet or Java, though it is conceivable that some temporary base on our Earth may be utilized. They are not constructions of the Atlanteans or other ancient peoples preserved in caverns against that coming day of need. We mention these hypotheses because they have all been seriously advanced. Our categorical denial should really be read this way. We have no evidence that any of these explanations is correct, and none of them coincide with what we believe to be the correct facts. But we offer the first word and not the last in this matter. New data may appear at any time. To these denials, let us add, the etheric craft, the discs, do not come from any other planet, meaning a visible astronomical body only, of our solar system or from any other heavenly bodies known to us. So far as a popular explanation exists, this planetary one is most in favor. Going to pause for a moment. So now he's stating what has become vogue at the time and has been vogue since. The extraterrestrial hypothesis. That was the most popular theory postulated that the public has grasped onto because it is the most provable one that they could make, even though nothing's ever come of it since. Still, it has never been proven. But yet, this is the one they latch onto because it's something that's physically measurable. Let's put it that way. And that's exactly what they're looking for. Some objective way of exploring this phenomena. Even though that is the popular reason, the reason is obvious, and the reasoning goes this way. The discs are not made on this earth. Yet they are real and not illusionary. Therefore, they must be made on some other planet, presumably Mars or Venus, since these are the nearest. This reasoning, however, suffers from what logicians call an omitted middle, or a third somewhat alternative, which is often overlooked. Can you build a better mousetrap, asks a magazine writer recently, clearly distrusting his own planetary theory, yet unable to think of anything else. We reply promptly, we certainly can. The simplest description of this mousetrap is our present objective, and if your patience permits, we shall try to make the whole concept reasonably clear. Though not necessarily acceptable to your personal thinking, of course. Going to pause for a moment. So now they have a logical explanation for what and who and where and how these things manifest. This explanation will be rejected by most because it doesn't fit into their neat little paradigm of their belief system. Their cognitive dissonance will not allow them to accept such an explanation because it defies their own perception of the world around them. So what does Meade Layne say that these things are? He says, what are the disks and where do they come from? We shall have to combine the questions and answers. They come from the region of existence called the etheric plane, or the etheric level, and by us with the name Etheria. So I'm going to pause for a moment. So Meade Layne and his associates at the Borderland Sciences Research Association, or Foundation as it later came to be known, applied the name Etheria to this borderland from which these things come from, the etheric plane. He decided to call it Etheria. Now, this is a very broad region and a broad overlapping term to take in all of what could be considered the etheric plane. It does not give a very precise explanation, but it does give an explanation nonetheless that seems feasible. So let's continue. So he says, who operates them? And he answers, the etheric people, also called the Etherians, by Meade Layne and Associates here. Are they friendly or hostile or dangerous? Neither friendly nor hostile on the whole, but mainly indifferent towards us. But they are not indifferent if we attack them or pursue and annoy them or make them uncomfortable, apparently by our atom bombs, the release of atomic or nuclear energies. Going to pause for a moment. So now he's basing this on observational data, that they don't seem to be hostile in any way. They seem to be indifferent to us, unless, of course, we do something to perturb them. He says, further on this point, it is highly likely, not provable, that our Air Force has already lost more than one ship through their attempted interference with these etheric craft. It is believed and is probable that they are surrounded by a powerful magnetic field or some force corresponding to it, which easily disintegrates our own aircraft. It is likely that the release of atomic energies is felt on the etheric levels with some discomfiture. It is possible, though wholly conjectural, that they might intervene to prevent a world war with atomic weapons, and especially with such a weapon as the proposed hydrogen bomb. I'm going to pause for a moment. So now, early on, Meade Layne and his associates at the Borderland Sciences Research Foundation were making connections between nuclear weapons and atomic bombs and their use, and perhaps that the detonation of some such device affects the etheric plane in some way and perturbs the environment for these intelligences that come from this etheric plane, according to them. Now, this is the theory that's postulated here. So, is it possible that things we do here in this physical reality that we accept can possibly have an effect within this etheric realm? Well, it seems feasible, and it does seem to be something that would stand up to some scrutiny if you understood some of the old occult sciences. And this is the problem. Many in the modern era reject these older ways of thinking and these knowledges that have been brought forward by the secret society groups and the occult fraternities through the course of time, we've long since rejected a lot of that in the mainstream scientific paradigm, but certainly it proffers us an explanation that seems more feasible than any physical type of a thing we could come up with as a proposal for cause and effect for this phenomena. But let's go ahead and continue on. He says, but then why do they come into our skies at all? And he says 2 reasons can be suggested, or 2 aspects of the same reason. These etheric craft have appeared at intervals throughout history, sometimes without a definite correlation with Earth events, but always, it is said, when a civilization or culture had reached its peak and was entering upon a period of decline and fall. Their purpose was simply to observe and study the conditions and state of humanity for their own information and their historical archives. They have also appeared prior to terrestrial convulsions, such as volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. In the present instance, it is likely that both reasons exist. The social and political state of the world is indeed perilous. Our weapons have become a menace to the Etherians themselves, and it is said that seismic disturbances are impending. Over the Pacific slope, for example, the flight of ether ships has followed the magnetic meridians north and south. It is said that the Etherians are doing this in order to observe the formation of the etheric vortexes, which presage an earthquake. They are charting this area and also the whole of the Earth's surface for the same general purpose of scientific study. Going to pause for a moment. So now he postulates that perhaps these beings, these intelligences from the etheric plane, are studying the physical region, this dense chemical region in which we exist, for various reasons, and they could see things in the causative state, in the etheric, that we don't detect in the physical, and that perhaps they are monitoring this and charting this. This is the claim here. Now, a lot of this is very much speculative, but it makes sense if you look at it from the perspective of what was known to the occult sciences of antiquity. And, of course, I caution you, you do need to take a lot of this stuff with a grain of salt. And what you need to understand is whether you believe it or not, there are people in positions of power in this world that very much believe in some of these precepts, and the things they do to act upon their beliefs in these precepts will affect all of us. So if they understand or have a fundamental understanding, or think that they have a fundamental understanding, that this UFO phenomena that keeps occurring and has occurred throughout all of human history has to do with visitors from some other plane of existence, then the things they do to deal with this will affect all of us in some way, shape, or form, because they're going to use perhaps some exotic type sciences or technologies to deal with these things. And we don't know what kind of effects this technology or science can have upon the rest of us. We're talking about things in terms of frequency and vibration, emanations, energy forms, radiations, all kinds of things like this that perhaps they've taken into consideration when trying to deal with this phenomenon, or the appearance of this phenomenon. Now think back to some of the other stories that have emerged in UFO culture or ufology culture. Things have been said about how advanced targeting radar systems have been used to bring these craft down. Is that feasible? Well, you're talking about, once again, using a pulsed frequency to direct at a target and affecting it in some way, shape, or form. Now, if everything relates back to frequency and vibration, perhaps there's some truth to this. Maybe this is something that's been done, and they have developed a lot of technologies that use these different types of frequencies and radiations to get things done. And some of them have really deleterious effects on the human body. And this is well documented. So you have to consider, why are they doing some of the things they're doing? Why are they completely ionizing the atmosphere and trying to change the resonant frequency of the entire Earth? Does it have something to do with this phenomena? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't pretend to have the answers. I'm just proffering the questions to you and telling you what it is that's been postulated by those brilliant minds of the past, and I'm sure all of this has been considered by those within the intelligence and government structures of officialdom of the military-industrial complex. Keep this stuff in mind. I think it's pretty fair to say that it's well documented that they use a type of off-the-books physics in the development of technologies within many of the special access programs and the corporations that subcontract out to governments pursuing these types of works, especially when it comes to aircraft and spacecraft and things of that nature. I think that's well established. So does this off-the-books physics and science that they use have alignments with the things taught in the secret doctrine here, the postulates put forward by the Rosicrucians and some others of these occult fraternities? I think it's fair to say it probably does. Seems to line up one-to-one with some of the precepts that can be known from the old natural sciences that have been brought forward in secrecy by those occult groups. So here, let's get back to what Meade Layne has to say. He says, "Now, whatever you think of the ideas and explanations here advanced, remember that there is nothing vague and uncertain about the presence of these strange craft or about their remarkable speed and power and complete superiority in the air. This is an intensely practical matter, and how far-reaching it may be, no one can say. This means that our personal attitude is also a matter of practical concern. Let us remember that the Etherians are not ill-disposed toward us, that we should not fear them, should never attack them. Further, phenomena are almost certain to occur, and may be the most remarkable kind. Panic and superstitious fear may seize upon the masses. It may happen that a considerable measure of responsibility will fall upon those who have some measure of understanding of what is taking place. Heretofore, the Etherians have withdrawn quietly when their mission was completed. Men thought of them as gods or angels or spirits or of the air or demons, embodied them in folklore and mythology, and forgot them little by little. So it may be this time. They may withdraw from our skies, and in a few months men will have almost forgotten them. But there are reasons which cannot be elaborated here for believing events may take another and more striking course. Neither your will nor mine can stay these events, but fear, fanaticism, and panic may work incalculable woe. Panic is contagious. It engulfs one like an enormous wave, and at the moment we fancy ourselves cool, calm, and superior of mind, are dragged under by it. No other considerations would lead us to write these pages, which will for the most part be read with derision or be wholly disregarded." So I'm going to pause for a moment. So Meade Layne and his group, they were trying to apply their knowledge of some of these occult methodologies and old occult sciences to this phenomenon, and they were thoroughly convinced that the things they were postulating would be outright rejected by the scientific mainstream, and they weren't wrong, were they? But it stands to reason to think that in the background, quietly, perhaps in secret, in some compartmentalized programs, government and quasi-government agencies and military contractors pursued some of these occult science approaches to this problem. And it was a problem. So I don't think it so much fell on deaf ears as much as this guy thought it would. But it probably opened the door for more compartmentalization of programs. They like to use secrecy. It's a long-established fact with matters like this, that they like to clamp a lot of this up in compartmentalized programs because they don't want the average person to have access to this information. And originally, I think, perhaps in that time frame, in the end of World War II and the post-war phase, I think legitimately, perhaps people who had a little bit more insight into this phenomenon at that point rightly thought that it would probably be better that the public didn't have knowledge about this because it would cause panic and it would probably break down domestic order. So they decided to keep it hidden and compartmentalized, but it exploded and escalated out of control. They lost control of the subject matter, and it became so clamped up in secret programs that even today, we're struggling to get the barest information, the most basic information out of some of these compartmentalized programs that have been happening since that time. So that's how we wind up with the problem we have with this. Now, many people will outright reject the UFO phenomenon in and of itself and claim that it's nothing more than human technology. And I do believe that, to some degree, a lot of it is. But I think there's also something more to this. This phenomenon has been with us for as far back in history as we can look, and it's not always explained away by some type of a nuts and bolts human technology. There's something else present here. There's more to the phenomena than that. And there are other intelligences that have been observed through the course of time and given different descriptions through different times and cultures. Is it part and parcel of the same thing? It seems reasonable to think so. And where and how is this present? Well, this explanation given here seems to be the most logical one that explains this whole series of phenomena. When you go back and you look in history at the many things that have been explained in the past or observed in the past relating to this, things like the presence of spirits or fairies or some such thing as outlined in mythological contexts and cultural contexts and folklore, things of this nature have always been ever present. And in the modern era, it takes on a more technological spin, but it is part and parcel of the same thing going on. Now, how would you explain this? Well, this would be explainable if you understand that we have this etheric sublayer of our reality that exists, and sometimes things phase in and out of physical appearance in the dense chemical region in which we exist from this etheric region. This is the theory postulated here, and it does seem to have some merit. But then that brings the other question. This etheric layer, or this area that they referred to here as Etheria, where is Etheria? One matter of immediate practical interest, the inevitable question, where is Etheria? If you think where is an easy question, go put it to the philosophers. But some answer must be made, so here is a reply in a few lines to be elaborated perhaps on subsequent pages of this work. Etheria is here, if we know what here means, alongside, inside, outside of our world. Because our world, that is the so-called dense matter of the objects in our world, is a rarefaction. It is spaced out like a vast net, a net with enormous meshes. Imagine, if you will, a net of wire with meshes a mile wide. Would not wind and water flow through the net as if it did not exist? A little friction, very, very little. On the strands of these meshes we live. That is the so-called dense matter of our world. We look out across the mesh and do not see anything in it, or hear or feel anything in it, and so call it empty space, meaningless words in the abysses of folly. We see, hear, feel the other strands of the mesh, and call our world solid, firm, and material. Call it a real and substantial thing. But the spaces of the mesh are 1,000 and 10,000 times greater than the substance of the strands. What is in these spaces of the mesh of our matter? Space. Space is not nothing. Space is stuff, is matter. What kind of matter? The matter which makes the ethers. More dense, not less, but more dense by far than the rarefactions of our world. The matter of the etheric world. inside the molecules, inside the atoms, still other atoms inside of those, or 10,000 Chinese eggs each inside of another. If you think that this is imagination, or that there is no room for these interpenetrating universes, ask the physicist and the mathematician. They will tell you there is nothing in the omniverse but room, and room again is space, is stuff, is basic world stuff, mind stuff, life stuff, and there is no emptiness anywhere, and that is why Etheria is here, but it is also everywhere. All heavenly bodies have an etheric realm. Gonna pause for a moment here. So now we're learning some things. Now this guy postulates that etheric matter is denser than the chemical matter that we are familiar with here. That's not the case in much of what's given in the old occult teachings and the secret doctrine from the various groups. They say that ether is less dense, it is more fine. This guy espouses the backwards or inverse concept here. Now, is it correct? I don't know. I have my reasons to think that he's incorrect in this assertion that he makes here. But it's actually the opposite of that. That it is only through the stepping down from the etheric into the dense chemical region that this takes place. Not the opposite. Not that it's a stepping down from this dense chemical region deeper into the etheric. But I think his idea, nonetheless, is applicable. You see, it's all about densities, if you want to look at it in terms of density. Now, this is a more philosophical way of approaching this. We are more physically dense than the etheric region, from my understanding of what has been postulated from the old occult sciences. So we would have to step into a less dense space, a different frequency range altogether, to experience or perceive the etheric plane. But this guy says it's a more dense state. I don't know if he's correct or not. I don't have the answers to that, but based upon the things that I have read and explored about these old occult ways of thinking and this secret doctrine that they talk about, this etheric plane, I would say it is a less dense region than the chemical region we exist in, and it's more malleable in that way. But does this mean that the concept itself is flawed? I don't think so. I think this guy was onto something, and I think his research group was onto something in exploring this avenue of thought, but exactly what they were postulating here may have been the opposite of how it really seems to work. Now, was this purposeful obfuscation on his part, or did he really suspect as much? These are the questions, and he was very familiar, as you get further into this reading, you know he was very familiar with the Rosicrucian conceptions and the theosophical conceptions of reality in these ways and how it all interrelated to this. So he says a few lines more, and we shall have done the more practical and pressing aspects of our subject. The etheric ships, as everyone knows, are of many types. Not all of them are discs by any means. Some are long and cigar-shaped. Some are shaped like balloons or dirigibles. Some have wings or wing-like attachments. Many of them appear to change shape while in the air. Their color varies also and has been seen to change. Some of them resemble fireballs. Others are accompanied or followed by smoke, vapor, and luminous appearances. Some are translucent or seem to glow from within. They travel at all speeds from 0 or stationary to thousands of miles an hour. They vary widely in size, from a few feet or yards in diameter to nearly incredible dimensions. We have reports considered trustworthy of at least one craft 10 miles in length. They have a curious way of disappearing suddenly when in plain sight, and also of rapidly dwindling in size without withdrawing in distance. It is well to bear all these items in mind, since any single explanation must obviously cover all of them. It is not enough to invent some theory for the disc-shaped alone, and then imagine what the whole matter is accounted for. Now, under the etheric explanation which we are presenting here, our understanding is briefly this. Going to pause for a moment, and then we'll give the postulation of this etheric principle, and this laid the foundations for other future thinkers like Jacques Vallée and like John Keel, and some of the conclusions they drew about the UFO phenomena that seem to ascribe the same perceptions that this guy saw about them. In my view, I think this etheric explanation is a more plausible one than an extraterrestrial one, based upon the observed phenomena that we see. That is my opinion, and I do reserve the right to be totally wrong about that, but it seems to me the extraterrestrial explanation that's been proffered for this is a misnomer, and it is purposely designed to lead people off the trail and take them away from the understanding of many of these old ways of thinking. They don't want us to be reconnected with the old natural sciences or an understanding of nature and the reality around us in the way that it has been postulated within the secret society groups and occult fraternities from generation to generation, from antiquity. Because to have a better understanding of this world around us gives those people with a vested interest less control of us. So without further ado, here is the etheric explanation of flying saucers, or UFOs. All of the types of craft just mentioned come from the same source. All are constructed by Etherians, or entities that live on the etheric plane. Their variety arises from the fact that many of them are experimental and that different types of them serve different technical purposes. These craft are built in matter of the etheric plane and are imperceptible to us since they exist in what we call empty space. They enter our plane or our level of perception by a process of materialization. The extremely dense matter which fills in the pattern of etheric stresses is replaced by matter of the kind that is visible to us, or better, its vibration rate is lowered until it becomes visible. A little like slowing down a very fast fan until one can see its blades. This is closely similar to what happens in the phenomenon or apportation, where objects of any kind or size are miraculously transported into and out of sealed rooms, sealed containers, and the like. Many people, and most scientists, take no stock in this alleged phenomenon, but it is well attested and cannot be surrendered on that account. Neither the pattern nor the molecular filling is destroyed. The object becomes invisible because the atomic motion is sped up, and it can pass through other matter, for example, a wall, because of this same fact. This is equivalent to an increase in density when an object on our plane is being apported from one place to another. To an Etherian, an object materializing on our plane would dematerialize on his. To us, it materializes in our field of perception and dematerializes when it returns to its etheric state. If we understand this, we are on the way toward accounting for the many odd items of behavior such as have been mentioned above. It is probably well known by this time that several of these ether ships have fallen and their contents carefully studied, although with utmost secrecy. We cannot enter here upon this part of which has been printed in some of the other publications that were put forward by this scientific research group, the Borderland Sciences Research Association. We wish to refer only to the little people, dwarves about 30 inches in height, whose bodies were found within the discs. Going to pause for a moment. Now remember, this was written in 1950. So this is postulating that governments and organizations have recovered some of these craft prior to 1950 and had found bodies, small bodies, diminutive bodies of aliens operating these things, and that these researchers from this group knew about this and had documented this as well. And that a lot of this stuff was kept secret or hidden, but was carefully studied. So he continues here, he says, "We have reason to believe that the Etherians, who must operate on their bodies just as they do on the etheric substance of the disk in order to accompany them, choose to materialize in small forms simply for the convenience of operation and flight. This, like everything else set forth here, is according to our best knowledge and belief at this writing. We repeat that we are offering the first words and not the last on this extraordinary problem. Gonna pause for a moment. So they're making some claims here and postulations about this. So much of this has been hidden and suppressed through the years. A lot of this stuff didn't really come out until much, much later. The notion that there were alien bodies recovered in the 1940s largely didn't receive a lot of mainstream recognition until the 1970s, when the story of Roswell came to the light of day. None of that was heavily explored or thought about at this point. And this guy knew about some other UFO crash retrieval, allegedly, and had claimed that this stuff was carefully studied. And he offered this etheric theory to explain this. The propulsion of the Etherian craft is beyond the present concepts of our science. Yet we have a good clue to its nature and shall comment on it later. There is no motor, propeller, or other mechanism inside the fallen discs so far as we have been able to learn. We must add the extraordinary fact that under certain conditions, or at certain states of materialization, or at certain altitudes and pressures, the substance of the ether ships is jelly-like and actually does change in shape and apparent size. The outer skin of the fallen discs, however, is harder than steel and of unidentified substance. Going to pause for a moment. So this guy seemed to know an awful lot about recovered discs prior to anybody else making those claims. Think about that. Was there something to his story? I don't know. I don't have the answers. He was a respected college professor, and he knew some things. And he put forward this scientific research group to study this phenomenon, and he was also a well-known parapsychologist as well. So he was exploring all these different ways of thinking, and he recognized early on that this UFO phenomenon could not merely be an extraterrestrial phenomenon. So he applied that line of thinking to his studies, and I think those in some of the compartmentalized groups that came about that were actually studying this for the military-industrial complex probably picked up on a lot of what he was researching. Let us continue here. It is our information that certain types of the ether ships are and have long been used for interplanetary travel. Those who persist in the belief that they come from visible planets of our solar system will eventually seize upon this as a confirmatory fact. But the ether ships do not originate on visible planets, as we have said. Interplanetary travel is simply one of the innumerable uses, and this fact should not mislead us. The craft are made in Etheria, or the etheric plane, and Etheria is in and around all visible objects. It is also the home and motherland of our plane. All the objects we see about us derive from that source, and our own bodies also. We ourselves are Etherians by ancestry and descent, for Etheria is home of the human race. That we should be so grossly ignorant of it is strange indeed. And I'm going to pause for a moment. So now there are certain reifications here of ideas that have been postulated by the secret society groups and occult fraternities for a very long time, that in fact a part of the manifestation process here in our physical dense chemical region of reality involves this stepping down through the etheric plane, and our physical form derives from there, and that every human being, every creature, every object in this dense chemical region has an etheric double. Now, this is postulated about here later in this work as well, and that this etheric double perhaps has something to do with the reason why we will sometimes perceive this phenomenon and sometimes not. So next it says here, some will understand. It is this ignorance and the kind of understandable intolerance which must accompany it, which makes it so difficult, almost impossible, to explain this matter to many readers, not excluding the average scientific worker, the professional man, and the so-called intellectuals generally. The obscurantist effects of the academic and professional background are in fact well known, except to those afflicted by them. There are, however, some millions of people less victimized by the hypnotic streams of our pseudo-culture who will well understand what we are trying to set down. So, what he's saying here is the intellectuals, the academic crew, the scientists, all of those heavily indoctrinated people will largely discount or discredit or disregard any of this information because they have been so trained through the course of time and through modern Western culture to reject any of these notions. All of this has been engineered out of our culture. Any of these concepts of the old natural sciences or belief systems, they've been carefully pushed out into the background of human reason because many of these things cannot be objectively measured and therefore are not subject to scientific method as a means of analysis. And that being the case, you can't objectively prove this. Not in the way people would accept, especially those in the confines of academia. You see, they limit their own possibilities by their very stringent viewpoints. That's part of what's being presented here. He continues here by saying, having now disposed of the more urgent issues of this subject and following the intermission, it seems best to refer again to the subject of this cloud cuckoo land of Etheria and the possibility, probability, and even the necessity for its existence. We refer to it under this mythological title because most people, though they believe in heaven on Sundays and in hell when misfortune pursues them, are quite unable to believe that Etheria, being invisible, unheard, and untouchable, has any reality about it at all. We do not blame them particularly, at least not as much as we do some of our speculative physicists who are already up to their necks in Oriental metaphysics and hence should be reasonably open-minded. Yet it may be possible to invest the idea with a certain sweet reasonableness for a time, even though our indomitable common nonsense rejects it soon afterwards. If there are colors we cannot see, sound we cannot hear, and dense and solid bodies which we cannot discover by touch, it is certainly not too difficult to conceive of a world which, though possessing sounds, colors, and material objects, is yet imperceptible to us. It would be as unknown to us by direct perception as a man is to an ant, or a bird to a beetle, or a beetle to a fish. In its element, could be questioned and could make a reply. They would probably be deeply skeptical about the existence of men and birds. Unseen and unseeable entities alleged to be living right alongside of them in the same world. This is obviously a matter of what is called planes of consciousness or awareness, and not really in the same world at all. The ant world is the nest or the hill. The fish world is limited in their area of the sea, and though it happens that man can peer in on both of them, they have no way of discovering him. At this point, the fruitful principles of analogy suggest that possibly there are invisible beings who can peer in on men also. He may be the crux of creation or the cross of affliction of it, but is not necessarily its crown, and though reputed to be a little lower than the angels, this earth manifestation of him at least may be but little higher than a caterpillar in the eyes of the unknown but observable intelligences. This somewhat despiteful guess, however, is a little by the way we intended to return to our high school physics with reference to our perception of sound and color. So I'm going to pause there. So essentially what he's saying is we largely reject these ideas, but we shouldn't, because by analogy, we know that fish exist in this same world, and we can observe them and see them, but they have no conception of our reality, of our world, of the world we live in. They have no conception of that. Is it possible that there are some other beings that live in this etheric state that we cannot perceive and have no understanding of in much the same way? It seems logical. You can infer this through the law of analogy. But at any rate, this is the postulation given here, that the existence of these unidentified flying objects and their pilots come from the etheric plane. Now, this seems perfectly reasonable if you understand a little something about the worldview of the occult fraternities. And this, I think, is the key to understanding this phenomenon. I don't think it's so much extraterrestrial as it is interdimensional, in a sense. An etheric phenomenon. It ticks all the boxes. Let's put it that way. But unfortunately, I think that is all the time we have for tonight, so we're going to have to continue this in a part 2, because this is a fascinating subject. At any rate, I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I'll remind you that I appreciate each and every one of you. We'll catch you next time. Have a good one now.